Hi, everyone, and we thank you for staying up later. Bob Costas has the week off. I'm Matt Lauer, and we appreciate you joining us. You will know our guest tonight from his roles in movies like The Magnificent Seven, Superman 3, and Bullet. You will absolutely remember him as Napoleon Solo from the TV series The Man from U.N.C.L.E. But did you know he has the distinction of being the only actor to ever date both Betty Anderson and Laura Petrie? Of course, this is before she met Rob. He is Robert Vaughn, and it's nice to have you here.
I've forgotten about that somewhat.
Warren Beatty eats your heart out.
Warren Beatty, nothing.
You, a lot of people in the audience are probably watching right now, and they're saying, he's a heavy, he played a lot of heavies, and he also tended to play that cool, calm, collected, slick, secret agent type. Fair characterization?
Well, of my screen persona, in real life, I'm a babbling hysteric.
So it was quite a stretch for you.
Yeah, absolutely.
When The Man from U.N.C.L.E. was popular in the 1960s, 5 seasons?
64 through 68, yes.
Okay. Top 20
Yeah.
at least once?
Yeah.
How big a hit was it in the perception of viewers? How big a star did you feel you were?
Well, I never thought when I was a young actor growing up with Dennis Hopper and Warren Beatty and people like that, we were all terribly serious. We all came to town about the same time, that I would ever have a career some 10 years into it where I was treated as a rock star instead of an actor, and that's basically what it was. When you go to an airport, either in the United States or London or Tokyo, be thousands of girls there screaming and yelling and ripping your clothes off, and that was something I never expected when I was studying acting with Chekhov.
What a miserable experience.
No, it was quite a delightful experience. I loved it.
Adrian Napoleone.
Napoleon, where are you?
Well, right now I'm being administered onto by a very beautiful young lady.
Forgive me, I should have known.
You should have. I'm going to be under the weather for a little while here. What are you doing?
Trying to figure a way into Strago's winery. I'm not as fortunate as you.
No, you're not. That's true. Keep in touch.
Why was the show so popular?
Well, it came right on the heels of the craze for James Bond. The 2 Bond pictures were out, Goldfinger and From Russia with Love. And this, of course, was James Bond on television. I was in the living room as opposed to the bedroom. That's where you could be in the 60s. And it just capitalized on that, plus the fact that I think that in the 60s, with all the problems that were going on, both domestically and overseas, it was a tremendous escapist fair.
Cold War.
Yeah.
I mean, we had a known enemy sitting out there somewhere.
Yeah.
You had a known enemy every week.
Thrush, right. A lot of people thought that there was some kind of a Cold War effort on the part of the producers to simulate the Soviet Union and the United States. Of course, it had nothing to do with that. It was really totally fictitious.
For the people who are sitting there going, Uncle, UNC, what did it stand for?
The United Network Command for Law and Enforcement.
One of the things about Man from U.N.C.L.E. was that it had a very diverse audience. There were older people watching this, young kids watching this, and talk about rock star status, the Beatles watched The Man from U.N.C.L.E.
Well, the Beatles watched the show, and as a matter of fact, on their second trip to Los Angeles, my press agent happened to be their press agent, and he asked them he asked the Beatles what they wanted to do on this trip, and they said they'd like to meet me, so I met them at Capitol Records on Vine Street in Hollywood, and the crowds were so great that they had to hire a Brinks truck to take us out of the area and take us to the Bel Air Sands where they were staying. I have a picture of myself standing between the 4 of them, and in the middle, and they have, all the talk was the long-haired Beatles, and the very conventional hair that we wear today.
You have a favorite episode?
I think my favorite was with Jack Palance. It was a 2-hour show. We did 8 2-hour shows that were on television as 1-hour segments on consecutive weeks, but they were released overseas as movies. And they did, in relation to their costs, much better than the Bond pictures.
Really?
Yeah, they had tremendous audience response, particularly in England.
Look, Thrush Central doesn't need this girl. I'm sure they couldn't care less about her. I care, Mr. Solo. After you, my dear.
No.
Panicle her in there. Mr. Solo, will you be getting into the car under your own power, or you keep her quiet? All right, look, you. I'll be back here. Look at him. After him.
You did have great movie roles, terrific movie roles that stand the test of time. The one that I think is the most enjoyable for me to look back on is The Magnificent Seven, because of the cast involved in that. You had James Coburn, Yul Brynner, help me out, Steve McQueen.
Well, interestingly enough, the show had to be cast in 48 hours. That's my agent used to call it the show. When he was referring to movies, he would say, I got a show for you. And at that time, they had Steve McQueen, Yul Brynner cast, and they had 5 more of the 7 to cast, and they also had to cast Eli Wallach. And there was an actor strike that was going to start, I think, on a Friday night, so they had to make the decision for the other 5 within a 48-hour period because they'd already built the sets in Cuernavaca, Mexico. So suddenly, these 5 actors, who were relatively unknown in terms of motion pictures, were cast. James Coburn, Brad Dexter, Horst Buchholz, Robert Vaughn, and
Charles
Bronson.
Right.
Charlie had done a series, he'd done a movie called Machine Gun Kelly. He'd done a series called Man with a Camera. Jimmy Coburn had done a couple of series that didn't last very long. Horst Buchholz was an unknown German actor. Brad Dexter later became famous because he saved Frank Sinatra's life, but at that time he was totally unknown. And that's how it was put together. And of course, when we got down there, we all thought, well, this has got to be the biggest bomb of all time. We didn't have a script. The casting was done at the last minute. All we had was the Japanese story. And they used to slide onion skins under our door at night with the next day's scenes. And we think, well, you can't do a movie this way. This is not going to work. And obviously, it did work and went on to become, a minor classic.
Today, an ensemble cast like that, they'd put these people together for a month beforehand and let them build the chemistry.
Exactly. Well, we met, most of us met on the plane going down the day before we started shooting.
Tell me about some of these guys. Yul Brynner, I was watching clips from the movie this past weekend. Yeah. To watch this guy walk down the street with the guns, I mean, it's like, I own this street.
Well, he was very much like that in person also. He was the king of Siam as far as he was concerned, and he had just won the Academy Award a couple of years before. So the rest of us were mongrels, and he was indeed the king, and that's the way he conducted himself. He got married during the course of the filming on the set in Cuernavaca, and he sat on a throne, and we all came by and kissed his hand, except McQueen.
McQueen and he actually, there was a little bit of one-upsmanship.
Yeah, that was a real feud, and it really was the young challenger going after the old champ. I mean, Steve had a room on one side of me, and Charlie Bronson was on the other side. And every morning, first couple weeks we were there, there'd be a knock on the door at 6 o'clock in the morning. Steve would come in and say, man, you see how big Brynner's gun is, man? Too big. The next day, you see Brynner's horse, man? Too big, that horse. It was constantly in his mind, which was an ongoing thing in his life, was paranoia. And matter of fact, there was one scene that's often cut out of the picture when it's shown on television. He saw Brynner during a rehearsal take off his hat, and the sun hit his head. And Steve was very excited about that, didn't know what to do. And in the actual shot that was filmed and put on the screen, Brynner took off his hat, the sun hit his head, Steve took off his hat, reached down, filled it with water, and poured it over the top of his head and put it back on.
Not scripted?
Not scripted, no.
Just to show up?
Just to show up. It was a constant competition in Steve's mind. He was going to best the champ.
Did it make it difficult to be somewhat in the middle of that and just, or an observer?
No, we were all basically in our own way trying to do the same thing. We weren't verbalizing as much as Steve was. We were keeping our paranoia to ourselves.
Your character in that, interesting. Many different levels. You played the guy who was the king of the hill, but who lost his nerve.
He lost his nerve and really shouldn't have been hired for the job.
Have no fear.
Have no fear. My very words, 10,000 times a day.
Senor, don't punish yourself.
A man who has fought so many times. You must have great courage.
Till the day you lose your nerve.
Do you look back on that movie with fond memories?
Oh, absolutely. It was it was the second A movie I did. I'd done some other movies before, like Unwed Mother, where I did not play the title role, and Teenage Caveman, where I did play the title role. But I did a picture called The Young Philadelphians with Paul Newman, and that was just before The Magnificent Seven. And before that, I was nominated for the Academy Award, which is probably the reason I got cast in The Magnificent Seven, was because of that picture had just been out the year before.
This was a character of a guy who had been injured in the war, turned into a drunk. Yes,
he was a weak, wealthy Philadelphia mainliner who turned into a drunk, lost his arm in the war, and then was accused erroneously of murder. And Paul Newman, who was a corporation lawyer, never tried a criminal case, was called in to defend him, and he did successfully.
How was Newman to work with?
Well, I didn't know him before then, but he was very kind. He came down and did, it's the only time I've ever done a screen test in my life, and he did the test with me, behind the camera. He read the lines with me, and that was great. I got the part. The problem was, he was living in Laurel Canyon at the time, and he wanted to rehearse every night, which was fine with me, but MCA had just bought his contract out from Warner Brothers, so he was no longer with Warner Brothers. This was going to be his last picture. So we'd rehearse over a bottle of scotch in the evening till 9, 10, 11, 12 o'clock at night. I'd be at work the next morning at 7:30 in makeup. He'd roll in about noon. And since I was playing a drunk, it was fine.
That movie you mentioned, nominated for an Oscar.
Right.
You had a lot to do with that. You, some say, campaigned for the Academy
it was
Award.
definitely my press agent, who I had for 25 years, Jerry Pam, who now handles Roger Moore and the other Brit, Michael Caine, said, listen, this is kind of a minor A picture, bordering on B. Your performance is outstanding in it. I think you can get an Academy Award nomination if you bring it to the attention of the Academy voters. And the only way to do that is take ads in the trade papers, which usually in those days, studios took the ads.
And today.
And today. But I was, guess, one of the first to go out on a campaign for myself to make sure that the audience that saw the picture was aware of my performance. The ones that hadn't seen it would see it, and then maybe vote, and they did.
What roles do you think you should have had access to that you haven't?
Well, I really don't keep track of them in that sense. I suppose I should, and I should call my agent and say, how come I wasn't in this picture? But I really haven't thought about that too much. Most of the roles that I have gotten, the people have come to me directly. I haven't fought for them in any way. I suppose I should have, but I'm probably not temperamentally suited for that.
People write them with you in mind?
No. They just, suddenly they'll be going through a list of people, and they say, shall we have, how about Robert Vaughn? You know, there's the old thing in Hollywood, get me Robert Vaughn, get me a Robert Vaughn. No, how is it called? Who's Robert Vaughn? Get me Robert Vaughn. Get me a Robert Vaughn type. Get me a young Robert Vaughn. Who's Robert Vaughn?
Professionally, in the 1960s, you were experiencing the fame of television, movie roles. But there was a conflict in that many would say you at times put your causes above your career. You took chances that a lot of other actors did not take.
Well, you're obviously referring to the Vietnam War. At the time, I didn't think of it as taking much of a chance. Number one, I wasn't married. I had no responsibilities, so I figured I can always go back to teaching or something if the show business dries up. But I really didn't think of it in that cavalier fashion. I felt so very passionately opposed to the war that when I had an opportunity to use the forum that the man from U.N.C.L.E. gave me to articulate that opposition in a public forum, such as debates with Bill Buckley and Hubert Humphrey and situations like that, I said I must not, forego this chance. I must do it.
But it was unusual. Actors were not doing that at the time. Maybe they were more concerned with their careers or obsessed maybe with their careers.
Well, I sent out a letter during the height of my opposition to the war to 25, quote, on the record, liberal, if you want to call them, Hollywood stars who had been very involved from time to time in the past, at least with civil rights, as I understood it, saying if they were opposed to the war, I think they should speak up. If they were somewhat reserved about knowing why they opposed the war, I would try to help them out with information and background data and so on. Or if they were supporting the war, I guess I wouldn't hear from them. I actually never heard from any of them, but I did run into Paul Newman because I knew him, and he said he was wholeheartedly opposed to the war and was articulating that position, and would, of course, with Eugene McCarthy later on. And the other two I heard from were Tony Randall and Fernando Lamas, oddly enough, and both of them said that they were opposed to the war, but they weren't quite ready at that point to go public in terms of defining why they were opposed to it, but they subsequently did.
You talk about the forum, though. Think of the audience at home saying, this is the man from U.N.C.L.E. standing up on what would be considered a left-wing platform.
Well, at that time, yes. Then it became a across-the-board platform.
But at the time, it was incongruous.
Yeah.
And there had to be someone who pulled you aside and said, Robert, this is bad for business.
Now, I can say, in all fairness to the studio that we're sitting in, or at least to the network we're sitting for here, NBC and MGM, and even our sponsor at the time, Chevrolet, they reviewed all of the speeches that I made against the war, which were hundreds, and no instance did they try to in any way stop me from taking that position.
You knew the risks, though, that could have been present, because in college you wrote a dissertation on McCarthyism and the effect on the American theater. You saw people's lives ruined and wrote about it.
Yeah, I didn't equate my opposition to the war, which I thought was fundamentally a conservative position, because what I was trying to do was conserve American lives, with the McCarthy situation where people were alleged to have been communists.
But you knew what going against the status quo could mean.
Oh, yes, very much so, yeah. But I frankly didn't give it, I gave it more thought 10 years later than I did at the time it was happening. It's kind of like getting drunk. It seemed like a good idea at the time.
You mentioned Bill Buckley.
Yeah.
You had an actual debate. This isn't just a phone conversation, hey, Bill, you're wrong. This is a debate.
It was the first or second year of firing line, and he called me on a number of occasions, wanted to debate first in Constitution Hall in Washington, and we couldn't work that out. Then we debated in July of 1967 in Los Angeles on the subject of the war, and I spent at least a month prior to the debate not preparing myself on the subject of the war, which I had completely prepared myself for 2 years. I prepared myself for that, but reading Bill Buckley's writings, everything he'd ever written, everything in National Review, everything. As a matter of fact, I went to the extent of trying to get papers he'd written at Yale, make sure I knew everything about him as a writer and as a philosopher and as a political thinker prior to going in. I went to a matter of fact, I stayed in a monastery in Pear Blossom, California, where we didn't speak for a month.
It was that important to you?
It was very important. It was, once again, it was the young challenger going against the old champ.
Are you a pacifist?
No, definitely not.
You're not a pacifist?
Hit me.
You're not a pacifist, but you said on February 19th, 1966, quote, "No longer is justification necessary for war because war is no longer justifiable."
That's right.
Didn't you figure that out? Doesn't that make you a pacifist if you say war is no longer justifiable?
Of course it's not justifiable in a nuclear age.
Well, then you are a pacifist.
No, not at all.
Perhaps Mr. Vaughn will give his definition of pacifist.
Well, I'm sure that a pacifist is a person when attacked will not respond. If I am attacked, I will respond.
If you could look back and say, here's my resume, but I want to rearrange one or two things. Take something out, put something in. Where would the changes come?
Well, I think that I would probably have made a more concentrated effort after The Man from U.N.C.L.E. Ended to focus on my career, which I did not do.
But what do you mean?
Well, I was so tremendously personally distraught by the death of Robert Kennedy that I really left the country for 5 years. And although I didn't say I'm going to leave the country for 5 years, that's how it worked out. And I worked all the time in Europe, in motion pictures and films, and did did films back-to-back for 5 years. But it is at a time, I suppose I should have seized upon the momentum of the series and perhaps gone into another series for triple the amount of money in terms of salary, but I really didn't want to live in the United States from 68 on. Although I didn't consciously leave, I just left and didn't come back.
You followed your emotions.
Yeah. Yeah.
In the 60s, I know you became familiar with Bobby Kennedy. I have rather strong feelings about the scenario that ended his life to this day.
Yes, when I was hosting a radio show at KABC in Los Angeles in the early 70s, I used to get people calling in all the time with theories about the Kennedy killing, about the JFK killing, the RFK killing, the Wallace shooting, and so on. And on one occasion, after hearing from one guy over and over again, his name was John Christian, I invited him into the studio to give his vision and version of what happened to Robert Kennedy. And I then acquainted Christian with Allard Lowenstein, a very prominent congressman who was really credited historically with creating the Dump Johnson movement. I then put Lowenstein together with Vince Bugliosi, who was my commanding officer in the Army, who prosecuted Manson, of course. And between Lowenstein and Bugliosi, the two brightest guys I know, they agreed that there were more shots fired in the pantry at the Ambassador Hotel than Sirhan had in his gun, hence a second gunman.
Have you sought out a forum to discuss
Well,
this?
we had an agreement from Jimmy Carter where he'd be reelected in 1980 that he would appoint a special prosecutor to go into that case and that case only. He got that agreement through Al Blonstein, who was an ambassador to the United Nations at that time. Carter was not elected, and that's where the matter dropped.
When you talk about causes and social issues, obviously you felt so strongly about the Vietnam War that you took it upon yourself to speak out against it. When you see actors, celebrities today, it's almost become the cause of the month. Every celebrity, almost its requirement, has to have a cause. Have we cheapened activism?
Well, I don't think actors should become second-class citizens and unable to speak their mind on social issues because they are actors. On the other hand, I think that they should be able to truly articulate their position, whether it's the environment or whatever it may be, in an open forum with people that disagree with them. And so I see nothing wrong with it if they want to get on the Rush Limbaugh show or whatever and espouse their causes and let Rush hack away at them.
Before I say goodnight, I want to tell you that Robert Vaughn is involved in a very important campaign, a public service campaign called Playing It Safe, educating our children for safety's sake.
That's right. That's from First Alert Home Security. You can get it free from that organization.
All right, thanks. And it was really fun reminiscing. And nice to meet you.
Thanks a lot, man.
Robert Vaughn.
Okay.
Bob is back next week. We thank you for watching, and I'll see you later.